The cold air of the church wrapped around me at my son's funeral, but all I could see were the bruises on his wrist. And then my phone vibrated, a text message from Danny's own number. Mom, I'm alive. Don't trust my wife. A mother's intuition is a real thing. It's not a cliche from a movie. It's a physical presence. You feel it deep in your bones. A low hum of anxiety that rises to a scream when something is terribly fundamentally wrong. I felt it that day, more strongly than I ever had in my 68 years. It was a cold dread that settled in my stomach the moment I heard the news, a feeling that the world had tilted off its axis. Before I tell you the rest of this story, wherever you might be listening, in your car, in your kitchen, I need to know you're here with me. A simple like, a small comment below, it will let me know I'm not alone with this memory, that my voice isn't just disappearing into the void. I sat there in the front pew of St. Peter's Catholic Church, the polished oak of the casket gleaming under the soft light from the stained glass windows. My own parents had been eulogized from that same pulpit. I'd watched Danny receive his first communion right there at that altar, his hair slicked down, his face a picture of angelic innocence. Now, that same space was filled with the heavy, sweet scent of lilies and the mournful drone of the organ. All around me, people were weeping. The soft, muffled sobs of friends and distant relatives felt like a physical pressure, a sound that seemed to make the very air heavy. Stephanie, my daughter-in-law, was a perfect portrait of grief. She looked like a broken angel, her slender frame held up on either side by her friends, her beautiful face buried in a lace handkerchief. Her grief was a performance, loud and theatrical. She'd cry out in shuddering gasps, telling anyone who would listen about their profound love, about the tragic hiking trip that had stolen her Danny from her. I heard the words, the accolades, the shared memories, but my mind couldn't latch on to them. Inside my head, there was only a terrifying, echoing silence. As a nurse, I'd spent a lifetime in the quiet, sterile presence of death. I knew its rhythms, its textures, its final quiet peace. I had held the hands of the dying and comforted the grieving. But this felt wrong. This wasn't the quiet dignity of a life concluded. It felt like a poorly constructed stage play, and I was an unwilling member of the audience. My hands, covered in the black lace gloves my own mother had worn to my father's funeral, clenched the small leather purse in my lap. I could feel the coldness of its brass clasp seeping through the thin fabric, a small, hard point of reality in a world that had suddenly become a lie. My mind drifted away from the eulogy, escaping the oppressive sorrow of the church and landing on a Sunday dinner just 3 weeks ago. It was a warm evening for late autumn in North Carolina, the air still holding the memory of summer. Everything had seemed so perfectly, beautifully normal. Danny was at the grill in my backyard, the sweet, smoky smell of his signature barbecue ribs hanging in the air. He was telling a story about a difficult client, his face animated with laughter as he reached for the tongs to flip the meat. As he stretched out his arm, the cuff of his button-down shirt slid up just an inch or two, and I saw them. Dark, ugly bruises, circling his wrist in the distinct, unmistakable shape of fingers. My breath caught in my throat. The trained eye of a nurse, an eye that had seen thousands of injuries over 40 years, knew instantly that those marks weren't from bumping into something. That was patterned bruising. Those were the marks of a hand that had gripped with violent, restraining force. Our eyes met across the patio, and in that split second, I saw a flicker of raw panic in his. It was the look of a startled deer caught in the headlights, a desperate plea and a silent warning all at once. He flinched, pulling his sleeve down with a jerky, reflexive motion, turning away too quickly. He mumbled something about banging his arm on a new cabinet door at the gym, his voice suddenly flat. He wouldn't look at me again. From the corner of my eye, I saw Stephanie at the picnic table, chopping tomatoes for a salad. She glanced up, her eyes darting towards Danny. It was a look that lasted less than a second, but it was as sharp and cold as a shard of ice. A look of pure, possessive fury. Then, just as quickly, it was gone. She smiled at me, a bright, sunny smile that was a perfect, chilling counterfeit of warmth. "More iced tea, Kelly?" she'd asked, her voice as sweet as the tea itself. I remembered Stephanie's phone call, the one that had shattered my world 2 days ago. Her voice was a choked, frantic mess, a masterpiece of feigned hysteria. "Danny's gone, Mom. He had an accident." She told a story that was seamless, polished, every detail meticulously placed. Danny had gone hiking alone on a trail up near the Blue Ridge Parkway to clear his head from work stress. "He must have slipped," she'd sobbed, "and fallen into a deep ravine where the terrain was treacherous. The search and rescue team," she said, "had advised that a recovery was impossible. It was too dangerous, and the body was badly damaged." She'd lingered on that phrase, catastrophic injuries, a clinical, precise term. Now, I realized it was a phrase chosen for me, the nurse, a phrase meant to be a medical barrier, to shut down any thought I might have of wanting to see my son one last time. A closed casket funeral, she'd insisted through her sobs, was the best way to remember Danny as he was, handsome and whole. At the time, I'd believed her. The shock and the tidal wave of grief had been a thick fog, numbing my senses, silencing that persistent hum of intuition. But now, sitting here in the hollow silence of the church, her words replayed in my mind, not as the words of a grieving widow, but as lines from a well-rehearsed script of old, delivered by a consummate actress. The final prayer ended. The organist began to play a soft recessional. People began to stand, their movements slow and heavy, a river of black and gray. I remained seated, a stone in their midst. Inside my purse, my old simple flip phone suddenly vibrated. Once, then twice. It was a jarring, alien intrusion into the solemn quiet. It was probably just a spam text, I thought with a flicker of annoyance. Who would be texting me now of all times? I hardly ever received text messages. My friends and I preferred to call. People started filing past my pew, their hands briefly touching my shoulder, murmuring the empty, well-meaning platitudes of grief. "He's in a better place now, Kelly. Stay strong." I just nodded, my throat too tight to speak, my gaze fixed on the casket. The phone buzzed again, a longer, more insistent vibration this time, as if it were pleading with me to pay attention. I waited until the church was nearly empty, until the only sounds were the distant clatter of the caretaker putting away hymnals and the low hum of the overhead lights. My hands trembled as I finally opened my purse, its worn leather cool against my skin. I slipped on my reading glasses, the cheap ones from the drugstore that I needed for any kind of small print. The screen glowed to life, its blue light harsh in the dim church. One unread message. It was from a name that should have been impossible, a name that was etched on the memorial card in my hand. Danny. My heart stopped. For a full, terrifying second, I forgot how to breathe. The air in my lungs turned to stone. My hand shook so badly, I almost dropped the phone onto the cold tile floor. It had to be a mistake, a system glitch, or some cruel, twisted prank by a hacker. I took a deep, shuddering breath, trying to command my frantic heart to slow down, and pressed the button to open the message. The loading icon spun for what felt like an eternity, and then the words appeared. Simple, short, but they carried the weight of a world turned upside down. Mom, I'm alive. I read the sentence again and again. The letters were stark and unblinking on the small screen. They wouldn't change. Mom, I'm alive. My vision blurred, the beautiful stained glass window of St. Peter turning into a meaningless smear of color. The air seemed to thicken in my lungs, making it impossible to draw a full breath. This wasn't a joke. This wasn't a mistake. The phrasing, the simple mom, it was him. It was my son's voice in my head. And then I scrolled down and saw the next line, the one that turned my paralyzing shock into a cold, terrifying certainty. Don't trust my wife. In that instant, the floor of my world didn't just crack, it gave way entirely. Everything fractured and then reassembled itself into a horrifying new picture. The bruises on his wrist, Stephanie's icy glare across the patio, the perfectly polished, overly detailed story of the accident, the vehement insistence on a closed casket. They were no longer random, disconnected pieces of a tragic puzzle. They were a conspiracy. They were a plot. My son wasn't dead. He was in hiding. He was running. And the person he was running from was the woman out in the church lobby, accepting condolences, playing the part of the grieving widow. I went home in a daze, driving on autopilot. The familiar streets of my Charlotte neighborhood seemed strange and alien, as if I were seeing them for the first time. My small brick ranch house, usually a place of comfort and quiet, had never felt so silent, so menacing. I locked the front door, the deadbolt sliding home with a loud, definitive click that echoed in the empty house. Then I went through every room, a frantic ritual of checking every window lock, drawing every curtain, shutting out the world that no longer felt safe. I sank into my favorite armchair in the dark, the phone clutched in my hand like a religious talisman. I didn't turn on a lamp. I didn't make tea. I just sat and waited, my body rigid, my mind a chaotic storm. Hours crept by. The grandfather clock in the hall, a wedding gift from my parents, chimed 10, then 11. Each tick felt like a hammer blow against the taut silence. Just when I started to think I had imagined it all, that the strain and the grief had finally made me lose my mind, the phone vibrated again in my sweaty palm. A new message. This time it was an address. An old derelict warehouse on the industrial outskirts of town, a place I hadn't thought about in years. Below the address were simple, stark instructions. Midnight. Come alone. Make sure no one follows you. No explanation. No reassurance. A primal fear, cold and sharp, warred with the fierce, unyielding love of a mother. This could be a trap. Stephanie was clever, I knew that now. Devious. She could be watching my house this very second. But then the image of those bruises, the dark, violent shape of fingers pressed into my son's skin, burned its way back into the forefront of my mind. I knew I had to go. There was no choice. I went to my bedroom and peeled off the heavy black funeral dress. I put on a pair of old, comfortable jeans and a thick fleece jacket. I laced up my Skechers, the soft, worn-out walking shoes that had carried me through countless 12-hour shifts at the hospital. Tonight, I thought grimly, felt like just another long, uncertain night shift. The drive was agonizing. I kept my eyes glued to the rearview mirror, my heart leaping into my throat every time a pair of headlights appeared behind me, following me for more than a block. The road to the warehouse was a dark, unlit ribbon of asphalt that wound through a forgotten part of the city. The moonlight cast long, skeletal shadows from the overgrown trees that lined it. The place had been abandoned for as long as I could remember, a crumbling relic of Charlotte's textile past. Weeds grew thick and high through cracks in the pavement. I pulled my car behind a dense thicket of overgrown kudzu, cut the engine, and just sat, listening. The only sound was the wind, whistling a lonely, mournful tune through the building's rusted corrugated metal walls. I stepped out of the car, and the raw November cold bit at my cheeks. The main warehouse door was slightly ajar, groaning on its corroded hinges as I pushed it open. The air inside was thick with the smell of damp earth, rust, and the dust of decades. It was pitch black, a deep velvety darkness that swallowed the weak moonlight from the doorway. "Danny," I whispered, my voice sounding small and thin in the vast cavernous space. A rustling sound came from a far corner, followed by a hesitant footstep. A figure slowly detached itself from the shadows. It was Danny, but it wasn't the Danny I knew. My son, the tall, strong architect who was always so full of life and easy laughter, looked thin and gaunt, as if he'd been hollowed out from the inside. His face was covered in a patchy, untrimmed beard, and his eyes held a haunted, terrified look I had never seen before, the look of a hunted animal. He stumbled towards me and wrapped his arms around me in a desperate, clinging embrace. I could feel his whole body trembling, racked with shudders he couldn't control. We just stood there for a long time, me holding my lost son in the cold, musty dark. Finally, he pulled back, his eyes full of a terrible shame and a pain so deep it seemed to have no bottom. "Mom, I'm so sorry," he said, his voice a hoarse, broken rasp. Without me having to ask, he slowly, hesitantly, lifted the hem of his ragged t-shirt. In the weak, unforgiving beam of my phone's flashlight, I saw it, a roadmap of cruelty etched onto his skin. There were old faded scars, a pale white web of past injuries, overlapping with angry new bruises that were shifting from a deep, violent purple to a sickly yellow green. And across his ribs there were long, thin scratches, still red and raw, as if drawn by claws. My nurse's mind cataloged the injuries with a cold, clinical detachment, but my mother's heart just broke into a million pieces. "It started small," Danny whispered, his hand still holding up his shirt as if presenting evidence in a silent trial. "A shove, after an argument. Then a slap when she thought I wasn't listening. She'd always apologize after, cry, say it would never happen again." He told me how the abuse had slowly, insidiously escalated over the years. Stephanie, he said, especially after she'd been drinking, would transform into someone else entirely. Her rage was a hurricane without an eye, and he had become the coastline it crashed against again and again. He had done everything he could to hide it. He wore long-sleeved shirts in the middle of a humid Carolina summer. He made up stories about being clumsy, about accidents at the gym, and about walking into doors. He was ashamed. How could he, a 6'2" man, be beaten by his wife, who was a foot shorter than him? Who would ever believe him? Society didn't have a script for that story. The breaking point had come last week. She was drunk, Danny said, his eyes staring at a point somewhere in the darkness beyond me, reliving the moment. All I said was that maybe we should be more careful with our spending this month. Just that. That one quiet sentence had unleashed the storm. She flew into the kitchen, and when she came back, she had a small paring knife in her hand, the kind you use for peeling apples. She pressed the cold, flat side of the blade against his throat, her eyes blazing with a terrifying, unhinged light. "Don't you ever!" she'd hissed, her voice a low, venomous growl. "Tell me what to do." In that moment, Danny knew this wasn't about fights or arguments anymore. This was about his life. He knew he had to get out any way he could. The idea for the faked death came to him when he overheard Stephanie on the phone with their insurance agent, casually, coldly, asking about the payout details on his life insurance policy. "But why, Danny? Why did you let it get this far?" I asked, my own voice cracking under the weight of his confession. He sank down onto an old wooden crate, burying his face in his hands. "It started a long time ago, Mom. It really started after the 2008 crash." He explained in a low, pained voice that his small architecture firm, his dream, had gone bankrupt during the Great Recession. He'd lost everything: his business, his savings, his confidence. Stephanie, whose real estate career was just taking off, became the sole breadwinner, the strong one. Slowly, that financial dependency had curdled into absolute control. She managed every penny, questioned every purchase, treating him like an irresponsible child. He started to feel worthless, like a failure, a ghost in his own life. That financial and emotional abuse, he said, had eroded his self-worth so completely that it paved the way for the physical abuse that followed. He felt he'd lost the right to stand up for himself, because in his own mind, he was just a burden. And maybe, just maybe, he deserved it. After a long, heavy silence, Danny reached into the pocket of his worn jacket and pulled out a small object. It was an ordinary, cheap-looking USB flash drive, the kind you could buy at any office supply store. "This is the only thing that proves I'm not crazy," he said, holding it out to me in his trembling hand. He explained that for over a year, after the worst of the beatings, after Stephanie had passed out in a drunken sleep, he would sneak into the quiet of the bathroom. Standing in the dim light of the vanity, he'd use his phone to take pictures of the most visible injuries: a split lip, a black eye that was swelling shut, the deep, angry gouges on his back where her nails had dug in. He'd saved every single photo to this flash drive. He called it his black box, the one thing that recorded the truth of his long, private crash. "If something ever really happened to me," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "I wanted you to have this. We have to go to the police right now," I said immediately, my mother bear instinct roaring to life, demanding action. But Danny shook his head violently, the raw fear flooding back into his eyes. "No, Mom, it won't work. I tried." He told me about a night a few months back. After Stephanie had shoved him down the basement stairs, he'd called 911 in a moment of desperation. But by the time 2 officers arrived, Stephanie was there to meet them at the door, her face streaked with perfectly convincing tears. She calmly explained to them that Danny was suffering from severe depression after losing his business, and that sometimes, in his despair, he hurt himself. They looked at me, Danny said, his voice thick with the memory of the deep, soul-crushing humiliation. A guy who's almost 6'2". Then they looked at her, so small and fragile looking, weeping on the doorstep. Who do you think they believed? The shame of that night, the utter powerlessness of being a man no one would see as a victim, had extinguished any hope he had of finding help from the outside world. I looked at my son, my heart feeling like it was being squeezed in a vice. He wasn't just physically battered. His spirit, his sense of self-worth, his very identity as a man had been systematically crushed into dust. She had convinced him that he was the problem, that no one would ever believe his truth. I stepped forward and took his cold hands in mine. "Danny," I said, and my voice was steadier and stronger than I felt. "I believe you. I'm a nurse, honey. I know what a patterned injury from an assault looks like. And I'm your mother. I know your heart." I closed my other hand around the small USB drive. It felt solid, real, a tiny anchor of truth in a sea of lies. It was more than just evidence. It was his voice. "I'm not going to let you go through this alone anymore," I promised, looking directly into his haunted eyes. "We are going to fix this, together." For the first time that night, in the dim, flickering light of my phone, I saw a tiny spark of hope return to my son's eyes. We couldn't stay in the warehouse. It wasn't safe. My mind raced, clicking into the practical, problem-solving mode I knew from my years in the ER. I had an old friend from nursing school, Mary, who owned a small rustic cabin up in the mountains near Lake Lure. She only ever used it in the peak of summer. This time of year, it would be empty, quiet. I told Danny the plan. I would drive him up there tonight under the cover of darkness. It was remote, isolated, with no close neighbors, and most importantly, Stephanie had no idea it existed. "You'll stay there," I instructed, my voice firm with a purpose I hadn't felt in years. "You'll be safe there until I can figure out our next move. I'll bring you food, supplies, whatever you need. Your only job is to rest and let yourself start to heal." He nodded, the exhaustion on his face so profound it looked like a physical weight. The burden of survival, which he had carried alone for so long, had finally been shared. I saw his shoulders slump in a wave of bone-deep relief. Before we left the cold darkness of the warehouse, Danny pressed the USB drive firmly into my palm. "You keep this, Mom. It's not safe with me. She might find me. She's relentless." I took it from him, feeling its small, dense weight. It was no longer just a piece of plastic and metal. It was the silent, incorruptible witness to my son's torment. It was his story. I tucked it deep into a zippered pocket inside my purse. I knew, in that moment, that protecting this tiny object was now as important as protecting Danny's life. It was the only weapon we had in this invisible war. It was the key to exposing Stephanie for what she was and winning back my son's freedom. Everything I did from this moment forward would revolve around this small, silent witness. The drive up the winding mountain roads was long and quiet. Danny fell asleep in the passenger seat, a fitful, twitching sleep punctuated by low moans and sudden jerks, his body still fighting battles even in unconsciousness. I drove on, my eyes on the dark ribbon of road ahead, my mind a whirlwind. Who was I in all this? I was Kelly Cherry, a retired nurse. a grandmother who liked to garden and read mystery novels. My life was quiet, ordered, and small. I knew how to set a bone and dress a wound, but I didn't know how to fight a monster wearing a human face. Fear, cold and sharp, tried to creep back in. The old feeling of helplessness. But then I glanced over at Danny's sleeping form, at the hollows under his cheekbones and the lines of pain etched around his mouth, and a strength I didn't know I possessed rose up from somewhere deep inside me. A mother's love. It was all I had, but I knew it would have to be enough. After getting Danny settled and hidden away in the quiet solitude of the mountain cabin, I knew I couldn't just wait. I needed to act. I needed a legitimate reason to start looking into Stephanie's affairs. 2 days after the funeral, after a long, sleepless night, I called her. I pitched my voice to sound weary, frail, and confused, a performance I hoped would rival her own. I told her I needed some of Danny's paperwork to sort out his life insurance and other final affairs. We agreed to meet at their bank the next day. Sitting across the polished mahogany desk from the bank officer, a young woman with a sympathetic smile, Stephanie played the part of the bereaved wife to perfection. She dabbed at her dry eyes with a tissue and spoke in a soft, broken voice. But when I asked about Danny's main savings account, the young woman behind the desk said something that made my blood run cold. "Oh, it's a good thing Miss Davis was granted full signatory access to this account just last week. It will make things much simpler for you." My heart gave a painful lurch in my chest. Stephanie glanced at me, her expression a perfect mask of sorrow. "Yes," she said softly. "Danny insisted. He wanted me to be able to handle everything, just in case anything ever happened." Her explanation sounded plausible on the surface, but it gnawed at me, a discordant note in a carefully composed symphony of lies. I remember Danny telling me just a few months ago how Stephanie scrutinized every single dollar he spent, how he had to justify every little withdrawal from the ATM. Why would he suddenly, just days before his death, give her total, unfettered control over his life savings? I told them I needed a copy of the last 3 months of statements for the lawyer, an excuse I'd rehearsed in my head all morning. Stephanie seemed annoyed by my persistence, a flicker of irritation in her eyes before it was quickly extinguished, but in her role as the helpful widow, she couldn't refuse. That night, I sat at my kitchen table, the lamp casting a small pool of light on the papers, a magnifying glass in my hand, and I went over every single line. It was all there, a flood of extravagant online purchases from high-end stores, and then the glaring red flag, a single large wire transfer to an account I didn't recognize, an account with no name attached, dated just 2 days before Danny's accident. I decided to test her, to poke the bear and see how it reacted. The next morning, I called her, my voice full of innocent, grandmotherly confusion. "Stephanie, dear, I was just looking at these statements and there's a very large transfer here. I was so worried the bank made a terrible mistake." The other end of the line was silent for a beat too long. I could almost feel the cold calculation happening on the other side. Then I heard her give a short, sharp laugh. It was a cold, brittle sound, completely devoid of humor. "Mom, you need to rest," she said, her voice dripping with false, syrupy concern. "All this stress isn't good for your health." It was a threat, clear and unmistakable, wrapped in a silken bow of fake solicitude. That afternoon, she showed up at my house unannounced, carrying a container of chicken soup she claimed would help me feel better. The soup sat on the counter, forgotten. While she was there, she mentioned needing to get something from the basement, where I stored a few boxes of Danny's old college textbooks. I didn't think anything of it and led the way. The wooden stairs to my basement are old and steep. I went first, one hand on the rough wooden railing. Stephanie was right behind me, so close I could feel the warmth of her body. Halfway down, she tripped. Her body lurched forward, and her shoulder slammed into my back with a surprising, targeted force. I lost my footing, pitching forward towards the hard concrete floor below. Adrenaline surged through me. I just managed to grab the railing with both hands, my nails scraping against the wood, my body swinging precariously. My heart hammered against my ribs. "Oh my God, I'm so sorry," Stephanie cried, her voice a pitch-perfect imitation of remorse. "This step is so slippery." She reached out to steady me, her hand on my arm. But when I looked up into her eyes, I saw no shock, no apology. I saw a flat, cold, calculating expression. The message was clear. Stay out of my way. That night, I couldn't sleep. The spot on my back where she'd shoved me ached with a dull, insistent throb. That near fall had done something Danny's story alone could not. It made the threat real and immediate. It wasn't his fight anymore. It was mine. The danger was no longer a story he told me in a dark warehouse. It was a physical presence in my own home, standing right behind me on the stairs. I sat in my dark kitchen, looking out at the shadowy shapes in my garden, feeling the old wood of the house settling around me. I felt so small, so alone. What was I? A retired nurse against someone so ruthless and unfeeling? But then, the image of my son's bruised and broken body in the warehouse returned to me, and the promise I made to him echoed in my ears. I couldn't give up. I made a cup of chamomile tea, my comfort for a lifetime of stressful night shifts, hoping it would calm my nerves, but my hands still shook as I held the warm mug. The familiar floral scent did little to soothe me. Sitting there in the quiet of my home, a home that no longer felt safe, I realized I was fighting a battle no one else could see, for the person I loved most in the world. As you listen to this, have you ever felt that way? Like you were carrying a silent, crushing burden, fighting an invisible war for your family with no one to share it with? If you have, leave me a comment. Let me know. Sometimes, just knowing you're not the only one fighting in the dark is all the comfort you need. 2 days after the incident on the stairs, I came home from the grocery store and knew something was wrong the moment I got out of my car. An almost imperceptible shift in the air. The back door to my kitchen, the one I had checked and double-locked that very morning, was slightly ajar. My heart began to pound a frantic heavy rhythm against my ribs. I pushed the door open cautiously, the familiar squeak of its hinge sounding loud and alien. "Is anyone here?" I called out, my voice trembling, hating how weak it sounded. Only silence answered. I crept inside, my grocery bag clutched to my chest like a shield. Nothing in the kitchen seemed out of place. Nothing was broken. Nothing was stolen. That was what scared me the most. This wasn't a common burglar looking for cash or electronics. Whoever had been in my house wasn't looking for things. They were looking for something specific. My mind screamed, "The USB drive!" I rushed to my bedroom, my feet barely touching the floor, and went straight to the closet. I reached to the back of the top shelf and felt for the old carved wooden music box where I'd hidden it. It was still there. My fingers closed around the tiny drive. A wave of relief washed over me, so potent it made my knees weak. But the feeling of safety, the one I had taken for granted for 40 years in this house, was gone. My home had been violated. As my panic subsided, replaced by a cold, simmering anger, I started to notice the small things, the cruel, deliberate messages that had been left for me, like a snake shedding its skin in my sanctuary. In the living room, the silver-framed wedding portrait of my late husband and me, my most treasured possession that sat on the mantel, had been turned to face the wall, a simple, silent act of erasure. By the window, my prized orchid, a beautiful white phalaenopsis Danny had given me for Mother's Day, had been snapped cleanly at the stem, its perfect waxy blossoms lying limp and dying on the floor. These weren't acts of random vandalism. They were calculated acts of psychological terror. It was Stephanie's handwriting, clear as day. I can get to you. I can get in anywhere, anytime. You are not safe. Nothing you love is safe. The house I had lived in for more than 40 years, the place that held every memory of my life, now felt like a battlefield. That night was the longest of my life. I sat in a hard-back dining chair wedged against my bedroom door, clutching my phone, my thumb hovering over the numbers 911. Every creak of the old house, every rustle of leaves outside my window from the autumn wind, every distant car engine sent a jolt of pure adrenaline through me. I felt utterly and completely helpless. I was a grandmother, a retired nurse. My skills were in healing, not in combat. How could I possibly stand against someone so unpredictable and malevolent? The fear was a physical presence in the room, a cold, suffocating blanket that made it hard to breathe. I felt myself becoming invisible again, not to my family, but to an enemy who saw me only as a weak, helpless old woman, a mouse to be toyed with before the final pounce. In the dark hours before dawn, when the fear was at its worst and my spirit was at its lowest ebb, I couldn't stand it anymore. I turned on a lamp and went to my bookshelf, looking for the comfort of a familiar story. My hand brushed against a faded, dog-eared book of poetry by Maya Angelou that a patient had given me years ago. I sat down in my armchair, the one my husband always used to sit in, and let the pages fall open. My eyes landed on a verse I had read many times, but had never truly understood until that very moment. You may shoot me with your words. You may cut me with your eyes. You may kill me with your hatefulness. But still, like air, I'll rise. Those words were like a jolt of electricity to my exhausted soul. I thought about the woman who wrote them, about all she had endured in her life, the injustices, the pain. Her voice was never silenced. She had forged her pain into a profound and beautiful power. I read the poem again, and then again, letting the words sink into the marrow of my bones. I felt something shift deep inside me. The fear was still there, a cold knot in my stomach, but it was no longer in control. In its place, a slow-burning anger began to grow, a righteous anger, a mother's anger. Stephanie could break my orchid, she could invade my home, but she could not break my spirit. She had made a critical, fatal mistake. She had mistaken my quietness for weakness. She had forgotten that there is no force on earth more powerful, more relentless, than a mother fighting for her child. As the first light of dawn painted the sky in shades of gray and pink, I knew what I had to do. I closed the book, placing it gently on the end table. I couldn't hide anymore. I couldn't just play defense. It was time to fight back. I didn't know how, but I knew I couldn't do it alone. I walked to my kitchen window and looked out across the quiet morning street to Mr. Miller's neat little house. A widower and a retired police detective, he was a good man, quiet and respectful. We'd never spoken much beyond polite greetings when getting the mail, but today I was going to walk across that street and knock on his door. I was going to take a chance on the kindness of a near stranger, because this fight was bigger than me, and I desperately needed an ally. I took a deep breath, walked out my front door into the crisp autumn air, crossed the quiet street, and knocked on Mr. Miller's door. A few moments later, it opened. Mr. Miller, a tall man with a full head of silver hair and sharp, intelligent eyes that missed nothing, looked at me with polite surprise. "Mrs. Cherry, is everything all right?" he asked, his voice a calm, steady baritone. "Mr. Miller," I said, forcing myself to meet his direct gaze. "My name is Kelly, and I need your help. I think I'm in danger." I had planned on telling him a watered-down version of the story, leaving Danny out of it. But looking into his steady, perceptive eyes, the kind of eyes that had likely seen the best and worst of humanity, I knew I didn't have to. He invited me into a home that was the complete opposite of mine at the moment. Neat, ordered, and peaceful. He poured me a cup of hot, black coffee. My hands were shaking so much I had to hold the heavy ceramic mug with both of them. I started talking, my voice low and unsteady at first, telling him about the strange things that had been happening since the funeral. The feeling of being watched, the break-in, the broken orchid. He listened patiently, his gaze never leaving my face, not interrupting once. He just let me pour it all out. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment, his fingers steepled under his chin. "I reviewed my security camera footage this morning," he said finally. "It's an old habit from the force. My front door camera picked up a car cruising the neighborhood slowly yesterday afternoon, right around the time you were at the store. I ran the plate. It's registered to your daughter-in-law, Stephanie Davis." I stared at him, speechless. It was real. I wasn't just being a paranoid old woman. Mr. Miller leaned forward slightly, his expression kind but serious. "Kelly, I was a detective for 30 years. I know a scared person when I see one, and I know a predator. I don't know your whole story, and you don't have to tell me until you're ready. But I know you're in serious trouble, and I want to help you." The relief was so overwhelming, so powerful, it felt like a physical wave washing over me. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, I wasn't alone in this nightmare. I made a decision in that moment. I decided to trust him completely. I told him everything, the whole unbelievable story, from the text message in the church to the bruises on Danny's body. The only thing I kept to myself was Danny's exact location. I took out my laptop and showed him the contents of the USB drive. His face grew grim and hard as he clicked through the images, his jaw tightening. As a former cop, he instantly understood the power and the weakness of the evidence. "These photos are damning," he said, his voice rumbling. "But they're the words of a man who is legally dead. A good lawyer could tear this apart. She could claim they're fake, that Danny did it to himself out of depression. It's his word against hers, and his word is coming from beyond the grave." He sat back, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. "What we need," he said, his eyes narrowing with the detective's focus, "is something irrefutable. We need evidence of her violent nature now, directed at a living person." And then he laid out a plan that was both brilliant and utterly, bone-chillingly terrifying. "We have to bait the trap. The plan was simple in concept but incredibly dangerous in execution. I would have to create a situation where Stephanie would be forced to come and stay with me, to become my caretaker. While she was in my house, we would subtly provoke her, push her buttons with the small, irritating acts, until she lost control and showed her true colors. And the whole time, hidden cameras would be recording her every move. "You'd have to be the bait, Kelly," Mr. Miller said, his voice grave, making sure I understood the risk. It would be very, very dangerous. I looked at him, and all I could see was my son's bruised face and haunted eyes. "I'll do it," I said, without a moment's hesitation. For the next 2 days, my quiet little house transformed into a secret command center. Mr. Miller, with a quiet efficiency that spoke of years of experience, brought over equipment I'd only ever seen in spy movies. Tiny cameras, no bigger than a button, were hidden inside a digital alarm clock for my bedroom, a digital picture frame for the mantel, and even a pen sitting in a ceramic cup on my end table. He showed me how they worked, how the encrypted feed would stream directly to a dedicated laptop at his house across the street. We were ready. Now came the hardest part, the performance. I felt a strange calm settle over me, the kind that comes when all other options have been exhausted. The fear was still there, a cold knot in my stomach, but it was now tempered by a clear, sharp sense of purpose. I was no longer the victim. I was the hunter, setting a trap. On Saturday morning, I put the plan into motion. I went out to the old stone steps on my back patio, which were always a bit slick with moss and morning dew. I took a deep, steadying breath, then deliberately let my foot slip, twisting my body as I went down, putting all my weight on my right ankle, just as I'd seen so many patients do by accident. The pain was sharp, white hot, and nauseatingly real. It shot up my leg, making me gasp. As a nurse, I knew exactly how to make it look authentic, because it was authentic. I lay there for a few moments, groaning, letting the pain wash over me, until my neighbor from the other side, Mrs. Gable, saw me from her kitchen window and came running out, her face a mask of alarm. Everything unfolded just as we'd planned. The ambulance came. The paramedics were kind and professional. At the emergency room at Atrium Health, the X-ray confirmed what I already knew: a bad sprain, no broken bones, but I'd need to stay off it completely for at least a week. From my stiff hospital bed, with its thin, scratchy blanket, I called Stephanie. I made my voice sound weak, shaky, and full of pain. "Stephanie, honey, it's me." I told her about my accident, about the doctor's orders. "I hate to be a bother," I lied, letting a little sob creep into my voice, a performance I hoped would rival her own. "But I really don't have anyone else to ask. Could you possibly come stay with me for a few days, just until I can get around on my own?" There was a pregnant pause on the other end of the line. I could almost hear the gears turning in her head, the cold, quick calculation. A helpless mother-in-law, immobilized, alone in her house. It was the perfect golden opportunity for her to search for the USB drive without any obstacles. "Of course, Mom," she finally said, her voice oozing with phony sympathy. "Don't you worry about a thing. I'll be right over. I'll take care of you." When I got home from the hospital, hobbling on crutches and with my ankle wrapped in a thick brace, Mr. Miller was there, playing the part of the concerned neighbor. He helped me inside, arranged the pillows on the sofa where I'd be camping out, and made a show of checking to make sure everything was in its place. The digital picture frame with its hidden eye was on the mantel, its lens aimed directly at the living room. The alarm clock camera had a perfect view of my bedroom. "Everything is live, Let," he whispered to me as he was leaving, his hand giving my shoulder a reassuring squeeze. "I'll be watching from across the street. You are not alone." I nodded, my throat too dry to speak. My home was now a stage, and the lead actress was about to make her entrance. An hour later, the doorbell rang. I took a deep breath, steeling myself. "It's open. Come on in," I called out. Stephanie swept in, carrying a basket of fruit and wearing a compassionate smile that didn't touch her cold eyes. "Oh, Mom, you poor thing," she cooed, rushing over to give me a hug that felt as cold as a snake. Her eyes scanned the room, a quick sweeping glance that took in everything, assessing, cataloging. "You just rest," she said. "Let me get you some tea and tidy up a bit." And with that, she began to move around my house with an air of ownership that sent a chill down my spine. She wasn't a guest, she was an occupying force, here to pillage the truth. The first day was an agonizing, slow motion exercise in tension. Stephanie was the perfect doting daughter in law. She made me soup, she fluffed my pillows, she brought me my medication on a perfect schedule, her voice always soft and concerned. But beneath the surface, I could feel her restless, predatory energy. Whenever she thought I was dozing on the sofa, I'd hear her moving quietly through the other rooms of my small house. The soft slide of a drawer opening in the study, the faint click of a closet door in the spare bedroom. She was searching, methodically, patiently. She knew that flash drive had to be here somewhere. I would lie there with my eyes closed, my heart racing, feigning sleep, my entire body rigid with tension, knowing that just across the street, Mr. Miller was watching her every move on his monitor. That night, she slept in the guest room, right next to mine. I lay awake in my bed, staring into the darkness, listening. I could hear the old floorboards creaking as she paced in her room, a caged animal. The fear came rushing back, sharp and potent. I had willingly locked myself in a cage with a tiger. What if the plan failed? What if she found a camera? What if she decided to hurt me before Mr. Miller could possibly get here in time? The question swirled in my head, a venomous spiral of doubt. I clutched the blankets, my knuckles white, and prayed for morning. Tomorrow, I knew, would be the day, one way or another. The second day began with a heavy, oppressive atmosphere that you could almost taste in the air. The cracks in Stephanie's facade were starting to show. Her smiles were gone, replaced by a tight, strained line for a mouth. Her voice was clipped and sharp. When I asked for a glass of water, she slammed it down on the end table so hard that water sloshed over the rim onto my late husband's favorite coaster. "You should be more careful," she said, her back to me. Her patience was wearing thin. This charade of caregiving, combined with her failure to find the USB drive, was clearly making her unravel at the seams. Around noon, she brought a stack of financial papers into the living room, saying she needed to start organizing Danny's estate. This was my chance. She was frowning at a bank statement, her brow furrowed in concentration. I reached for the glass of water she'd brought me earlier. As I lifted it, I let my hand tremble. A convincing performance of elderly frailty, the water shivering on the surface. The glass tilted, and the water cascaded all over the neat stack of papers, soaking them through. "Oh my goodness!" I cried out, my voice a pitch-perfect quaver of apology. "I am so sorry. How clumsy of me." For one long, silent second, Stephanie just froze, her eyes fixed on the spreading dark stain on the papers. I saw her knuckles turn a white where she gripped the pen, and then something inside her snapped. The mask of civility didn't just crack, it disintegrated into dust. "Are you always this useless?" she roared, her voice ugly and distorted with a rage that was shocking in its raw intensity. She shot to her feet, her face a blotchy, furious red. This wasn't Stephanie, my sophisticated, charming daughter-in-law. This was the monster Danny had described. Before I could even flinch, her hand flew through the air. A slap. It was brutally fast and hard. It connected with my cheek with a sickening crack that echoed in the silent room. My head snapped to the side, my reading glasses flying off my face and skittering across the floor. My ear rang with a high-pitched whine. My cheek exploded with a hot, stinging pain that brought tears to my eyes. The pain was real, searing, but through it, I felt a cold, clear sense of triumph. We got it. I looked up at her, my eyes wide, playing the part of the terrified, helpless victim to the very end. In the moment after the slap, time seemed to stop. Stephanie stood over me, her hands still raised slightly, breathing in ragged, shallow gasps. I could see a flicker of shock in her own eyes, as if she couldn't believe what she'd just done. She had lost control, right on camera, right in the heart of our trap. I brought a shaking hand up to my cheek, which I could already feel starting to swell and throb, and just stared at her. My silence seemed to unnerve her more than any accusation could have, and in that ringing silence, we both heard a sound from the front of the house, the sound of a key turning in the lock of my front door. The door swung open. Mr. Miller stepped inside, his face grim, followed by two uniformed police officers. Stephanie spun around, her face instantly transforming from rage to pure animal panic. She looked from the officers to me holding my reddening cheek, and back again, her mind clearly racing, trying to formulate a new lie. It all happened so fast. Mr. Miller said nothing. He simply walked to my television, plugged a small device into its side, and pressed a button on a small remote. The screen flickered to life, showing the entire scene we had just lived, captured from the perfect, damning vantage point of the digital picture frame on the mantel. Stephanie's enraged voice filled the room, the swing of her arm, and the sharp, ugly sound of the slap. The play was over. When the video ended, the screen went black, but the image of the assault seemed to be burned into the air. Stephanie stared at the blank screen, then whipped her head towards the officers, shaking it frantically, her hair coming loose from its neat bun. "No, no, it's not what it looks like," she shrieked, her voice high and shrill. "She set me up. The old woman is crazy. She provoked me. She spilled the water on purpose." The words tumbled out of her, a desperate, chaotic torrent of lies, but her own raw fury, the same fury captured so clearly on the video, was now condemning her in real time. One of the officers, a tall, calm man with a steady gaze, took a step forward. He began to recite the words I'd heard 100 times in movies, words that now felt like the tolling of a great bell of justice in my own living room. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Each word was a cold, steel bar of a cage snapping shut around her. Her frantic denials sputtered out into choked sobs. She backed away, her wild eyes darting around the room, searching for an escape that wasn't there. And in that exact moment, the front door, which had been left ajar, swung open wider. A figure stood silhouetted in the bright afternoon doorway. Stephanie turned, and every last drop of color drained from her face, leaving it a waxy, chalky white. It was Danny. He was clean-shaven, wearing a fresh shirt and jeans. He looked solid, real, and tall. He wasn't a ghost. He was the living, breathing truth, come back to haunt her. Stephanie's mouth opened, a strangled guttural sound escaping her throat. Her entire world of lies, her meticulous planning, her grand performance, it all crumbled to dust in the instant she saw the husband she had declared dead and tried to bury. Danny didn't look angry. He just looked calm. He walked slowly into the room and stopped, looking directly at Stephanie with an unnerving stillness. His silence was more powerful and more damning than any shout could ever be. Finally he spoke, his voice clear and strong, with no trace of the tremor I had heard in the warehouse. "It's over, Stephanie." Just those 3 words, but they held everything. The end of the abuse, the end of the fear, the end of her suffocating control. It was the declaration of his freedom, a declaration he'd had to metaphorically die to be able to make. Hearing his voice, seeing him standing there, whole and alive, all the fight went out of Stephanie. She stopped crying. She just stared at Danny, then at my bruised face, then at the impassive officers. She had lost, completely and utterly. Her legs gave out from under her, and she sank to the floor in a heap, her hands limp at her sides. She began to cry then, not the tears of remorse, but the choked, frustrated, angry sobs of a predator caught in a trap, a queen deposed from her tiny, violent throne. The officers handcuffed her and led her out of my house. The front door closed and silence returned. But this time, it was a peaceful, clean silence. Danny walked over to me. For the first time in so long, he pulled me into a hug that wasn't desperate or frightened. It was the hug of a son who had finally, truly come home. I held him tight, patting his back, my eyes squeezed shut against tears of my own, tears of relief. We didn't say anything. We didn't need to. The storm had passed. We had survived. 6 months later, we sat on a hard wooden bench in a courtroom. It all unfolded just as Mr. Miller had predicted. The photos from the USB drive were displayed on a large screen for the jury to see, one after another, a silent, powerful testament to years of hidden pain. The video of the slap was played. The evidence was overwhelming, irrefutable. Stephanie sat at the defendant's table, looking thin and pale, all her former glamour and confidence gone, replaced by a brittle, hollow shell. She stared down at her hands, never once looking at us. The jury found her guilty on all counts: aggravated assault, insurance fraud, filing a false report. A wave of relief so profound it almost felt like exhaustion washed over me. It wasn't the joy of revenge. It was the quiet, steady peace of truth, finally acknowledged in the light of day. During the sentencing phase, her public defender presented her medical records. They told a story I hadn't known, a story of a childhood filled with unspeakable physical abuse at the hands of her own stepfather. They spoke of years of untreated trauma. Listening to it, I looked over at my daughter-in-law, this woman who had brought so much destruction to my family. And for the first time, Beneath all my anger and my pain, I felt a flicker of something else. Not forgiveness, not yet, but a sad, tragic understanding. She had been a broken child who had grown up to break someone else. The cycle of violence is a merciless, cruel inheritance passed down in darkness from one generation to the next. A year has passed now. Life is slowly finding a new kind of normal. Danny is in therapy and he's thriving. He started his own small architectural firm, focusing on community projects and sustainable design. The fear is gone from his eyes, replaced by a quiet confidence I haven't seen in years. The nightmares still come sometimes, he tells me, but he's learning how to face them instead of running from them. Our bond, once strained by secrets and distance, is stronger than it has ever been. We walked through hell together, and it forged something unbreakable between us. I spend more time in my garden these days. It has become my therapy. The orchid that Stephanie broke, I carefully repotted it, tending to it, talking to it. And now it has a new shoot, a bright green promise of future blossoms. I work the soil with my hands, planting new seeds, weeding out the bitter things, watching new life grow. The garden has taught me about resilience. It has shown me that even after the harshest, cruelest winter, life finds a way to begin again. Danny comes over on the weekends to help me. We often work for hours in a comfortable silence, the kind shared by two people who have said all that needs to be said and have found a quiet peace on the other side. He asked me once, as we were planting tomato seedlings, if I ever think about Stephanie. I told him the truth. I told him I do. I think about the legacy she carried, a legacy of pain and violence passed down to her, a legacy she then tried to pass to him. But then I look at my son, standing tall and whole in the afternoon sun, the smell of rich earth all around us, and I look at the flowers blooming all around my bed, and I know there is another kind of legacy, an invisible one. It isn't made of money or property or things. It's made of a mother's stubborn, unrelenting love that refused to give up. It's made of a son's courage to finally speak his truth and allow himself to be believed. That is the real inheritance, and it is the only thing powerful enough to break the cycle of darkness and finally let the light in. That garden taught me about resilience, about how life finds a way even after the cruelest winter. But it also taught me about the importance of being seen, of having your story heard. I know, a lot of the time when we get together, the stories just pour out of us like a stream. Today, I wanted to open up my heart a little, and I'm also hoping I can hear the stories of all you mothers and grandmothers out there. You know, sometimes just a simple click on a screen, a like, a subscribe, or a share might seem like a small, fleeting gesture to many, but to me, and to other quiet voices that need to be shared, each one of those clicks is like a small candle in the dark. It's a silent way of saying, I see you, I hear you, your story matters. It reminds me that we are not invisible. A simple click from you is a powerful statement of support for me, and it's the motivation I need to continue sharing these stories. After my story was told, something changed in me. For weeks, all I had wanted was for someone to listen to what was in my heart. And now that you have listened, I realize that what I want most of all now is to listen to what's in yours. Down below, in that comment section, I would be so honored if you would share a piece of your story with me. Tell me about a time you felt unheard. Tell me about a passion you have that others might have dismissed as silly. Or tell me about a moment you found your strength, even in the smallest, quietest way. I will read them. I will carry them with me because your story matters. We want to build Sapphire as a community where we can share these hidden stories from the bottom of our hearts. I know you will have your own private stories that can sometimes be difficult to share with family or friends. I am here to listen, to share in your joys and sorrows, because we always have the right to be respected and to be heard. If you don't have a sad story like the one I went through, then please share your happy ones. Tell me about a joy you received today. Please share it with me. It will be an abundant source of motivation, helping me and the other listeners who watch this to heal, to find faith and purpose in life. If you're watching this on a television, please don't hesitate to pick up your phone and search for my Sapphire channel. I truly hope to share these feelings with you. Let's build a community together where we can share our truest emotions. Let's make this a place where we listen to each other, a place where no woman has to feel that her life, her struggles, and her triumphs are invisible. Thank you again for sitting with me. It means more than you know.